Music has a remarkable ability to evoke memories, stir your emotions, soothe your anxiety, and spark your creativity. What is it about music that gives it such a unique power to influence your feelings and thoughts? Well, ahead, I'll talk with Dr. Elizabeth Margulis about Transported, the everyday magic of musical daydreams. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Elizabeth Margulis, Ph.D., is a professor of music at Princeton University, where she directs the Music Cognition Lab. Initially trained as a pianist, she turned to cognitive science to explore why music has such a powerful ability to transport the mind. She studies listeners' experiences with imagination, memory, and emotion through sound. Dr. Margulis, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Well, tell us about how you became inspired to want to study the impact of music on our minds.
When I was very small, my parents, who were not musicians themselves, nevertheless took me. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. They took me to Powell Symphony Hall for a performance of Handel's Messiah. And you may know that toward the end of that piece, it's traditional during the Hallelujah chorus for everyone to stand, right? I didn't understand that there was a historical dimension to this. What I understood to be happening was simply that the music was so overwhelmingly powerful that people literally could not stay in their seats. And it kind of just got underneath my brain in some way that this was this really mysterious, powerful phenomenon that deserved a lot of attention and scrutiny. So I ended up in all these various ways, first as a performer and then as a researcher, chasing that for a lot of the rest of my career.
Well, we want to talk about the research that's you've shared in this book. And obviously, we can't talk about everything that's in the book. So give us a brief overview. What are readers going to find here?
The book explores the science of how a song sends us somewhere else. So turn on a song, or even it comes on over the loudspeakers when you're at a cafe or something. And before you know it, the world around you has dissolved. You're lost in a personal memory or some kind of vivid imagining. And it turns out that over the past decade, both in my own lab and elsewhere, there's been lots of interesting research into why this happens, how this happens, and what we might be able to do with it.
Well, this is a common human experience, and, there's lots of anecdotal evidence, but how do you study this in a scientific way?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And basically, it wasn't until we had these new tools from machine learning around natural language processing that we were really able to do something like, instead of using the tasks that the psychology of music used for so long, where, you play people beeps and boops and you measure their reaction times, we could just have them listen to music and freely describe in a truly unconstrained way what it was they were thinking about or imagining while listening. And then because we have this powerful set of computational tools at our disposal, we could go through and analyze thousands and thousands of those to pull out the patterns and start to understand more about what's going on.
So what is going on?
Well, one of the things that surprised me the most was discovering that when we play people a new excerpt they've never heard before and just ask them to tell us what they imagined, person after person tends to tell us more or less the same thing. And we have the sense when we're having this kind of imagining to music that it's highly personal, subjective, idiosyncratic. But in fact, evidence shows that it's broadly shared.
So there's something sort of universal going on here with music.
There's absolutely some collective dimension, right? We do find that it depends on certain kinds of shared experiences we might not even know we have with each other. So we could go run this in different cities in the United States, and people go into a sound attenuated booth by themselves, and have this reverie that tends to be the same. But then we could go somewhere where people have a really different set of experiences. For example, we did research in a rural village in China where people speak Dong. And there we found the exact same phenomenon in that people had these shared imaginings to the music we played them, but what they imagined was entirely different than what the participants in the US imagined, although they were quite similar to each other. So we see these kinds of shared experiences emerging out of patterns of life experience, not in some kind of universal biologically endowed way, if that makes sense.
Often, we all experience this. You'll hear a piece of music and as you mentioned, you're transported. Maybe you're back in time, a certain place with a certain person, whatever it might be. But it's a very vivid memory that's brought up. So how does music have that ability to do that rather than us just thinking we've got, these things stored in our minds somewhere and we can just bring it up? But music is the key.
Exactly. And there's been lots of great research pitting music as a cue against other kinds of cue, right? Like people often think maybe smell is really special. Or taste. There's the example of Proust and the Madeleine. It turns out that no matter kind of what other cue you give people, music really does seem to have a special ability to generate a memory that feels really captivating and vivid in this way. And one of the things that we think is going on is because music is dynamically changing in time, it's kind of continuing to unfold your memory, right? In this dynamic way that can feel quite immersive. We know that music also has this component where even if you're just sitting still, the fact that music has a beat activates motor areas in your brain. So there's this kind of participatory, you're moving out of yourself and feel like you're actually doing a thing, even when, you might just be sitting on the subway listening to music over headphones.
What is the value of music in terms of stimulating your mind? There's one thing that, if it's a familiar piece of music, versus a piece of music you don't know. So your brain is reacting to something that's new to it.
Yes, I love this question because we find that people do this really easily, even to not only music that's new, but music that's in a style they're not familiar with. It uses different kinds of scales and different kinds of patterns. It's a very natural kind of response. And it's a lovely kind of entry point, both into making sense of what you're hearing and also into imagining what it's like to be someone else listening to the music who has a very different kind of experience. This is something I've done a lot myself since writing the book. I have teenage children, and I've had a lot of conversations with them about what they're imagining while they're listening to the music they love. And I found it to be a really trenchant way in to how they're experiencing the world and what's meaningful to them.
What is the value of music in terms of sparking creativity? Maybe I'm a visual artist, but I find that listening to music gives me ideas or inspires me about how I might communicate in a visual sense.
Yes. And part of this is music's power to kind of transport you to some unexpected place. So, if you think about conditions like anxiety or depression, where people can get stuck in these ruminative thought patterns, and the advice is often, go outside and take a walk, you'll get some new input in that'll, jut you out of this rut. But sometimes it's hard for people to really get out and do that. And one of the things that I love about music is it's this really low barrier to entry intervention, right? Where you can just cue up a song and, instantly change something about the spontaneous thought world that your mind is traversing.
I'm wondering, as you learn more about music and how it impacts our brain, whether that gives new insight into how we use music as therapy.
Absolutely. Yes. I talk about that a lot in the book. And in fact, there are really interesting traditions and practices of the therapeutic use of music that involve asking people to imagine kind of stories while they're listening. So this is something that's already happening, but there's some really wonderful consortiums of people in the medical profession and people in the sciences and people in the arts to try to really get the most robust set of data possible on all of this so that it can be used to the greatest good of the most people.
I'm wondering also about, again, sort of along the therapy lines and cognitive development. Is it important that we expose ourselves to new music and, different types of music, different genres that we might not normally listen to?
You might remember that there was this kind of craze in the 1990s around the Mozart effect. And the idea was, right, that there's something uniquely, helpful about Mozart, which turned out to really be a bit of a misunderstanding of the, psychology literature. But in any case, it spawned lots of well-intentioned effort by people to play lots and lots of Mozart for their babies, right? And in fact, what's better supported in the literature is early exposure to lots of musical styles, because it turns out, similar to language learning, there's a window of plasticity for becoming sensitive to certain kinds of sonic and temporal patterns. And babies start out being able to process all kinds of musical systems, and over the course of the first year, start to specialize in the music they're hearing a lot, and kind of prune some abilities to process some other aspects of sound. So we do have good data that, when infants are exposed to music of different styles using different sonic properties, they retain, for a longer period, the ability to have that kind of perceptual acumen for these different patterns.
I'm wondering also about just the world we live in today. It's, we're full of distraction. Everything everywhere is demanding our attention and kind of telling us what we should be thinking. So where does music play into this? And is it valuable kind of as an antidote to this world of distraction we live in?
Exactly. So if you look back, as recently as 10 years ago, estimates were that we spent a third to half of our day engaged in some kind of mind wandering. And what's key to know is that's not a failure of attention. That's this kind of, rethinking what happened, going through scenarios about what might happen in the future. That's key to developing a personal narrative and an identity and, deriving meaning in life. And now the time we have for that has just gotten, squished into the narrower and narrower window. Even when people do something like do the dishes or do laundry, there's often now like a phone playing or somebody scrolling through social media or something. And so music is, I think of it in many ways as the last refuge of the daydream. So, there's something coming in through the sound, but there's still this space for your mind to wander in the way that is so important. So I think that that's really a neglected value of music. And I really want people to know that if you're listening to a song and your mind wanders somewhere else, consider that may be part of it and part of how music works its magic, rather than some kind of failure on your own part to pay adequate attention.
I'm wondering also, we know there's a lot, you sort of find your people when you find other people who like the same kind of music you do. And I'm wondering, kind of how music plays a role there in sort of forming bonds with other people.
Yes. So, we know this is true because, think about what people put on their dating profile, right? One of the primary things people tend to list is what music they listen to. And, we know, I know from personal experience how hard it can be to share music that you love and watch someone be totally unmoved by it, right? There's something about that shared kind of internal experience to sound that does have this really connecting impact. And we know even at the various earliest stages that if we get toddlers to move in sync with an experimenter, so the way you might when you're listening to music, then that toddler is more likely to help the experimenter afterwards when they pretend to drop something, say, than if they had moved out of sync. So there is something about that kind of shared interaction to music and to time that seems to have some kind of effect on social bonding.
Well, this is a fascinating topic, and there's so much more here that we didn't have a chance to talk to. What are some of the key insights about music and the mind that you hope readers will take from the book?
Yeah, I really would like readers, because there tends to be such hesitance around music in our culture. So people will often tell me, I don't know anything about music, and kind of disavow any kind of expertise. Whereas if you actually look at even the basic kind of imaginative responses people are having, kind of where their mind wanders when they listen. It's showing that there's this incredibly sophisticated, rich network of associations that people have developed across a lifetime. And there are lots of insights that you can derive by paying attention to those daydreams, both about yourself and about the world you live in, and about how your own mind works. So my hope after somebody reads the book is that they're much more interested and respectful of their own and curious about their own listening experiences.
Well, to learn more, the book is Transported, The Everyday Magic of Musical Daydreams by Dr. Elizabeth Margulis. Dr. Margulis, thank you for talking with me today.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
If you'd like to purchase Transported, I've placed a link for you in the description below. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more books you might find interesting. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.